Hello, everyone. It's great to welcome you to this panel, A Planet on Fire, a Manifesto, and our wonderful panel who are going to discuss the implications of this work for democratizing work. So rather than holding up the proceedings, because I'm sure that you're going to have lots of questions once you've heard our speakers, I'm going to invite Mathew Lawrence, who's the co-founder of Commonwealth UK, to kick this off and to discuss this new book, particularly in relation to the climate crisis and the economy.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and hello everyone joining us virtually. I'm Mathew Lawrence, as mentioned, and co-author of Planet on Fire, Manifesto for the Age of Environmental Breakdown with Laurie Label-Langton. And I want to sort of just start in a way by just sketching a little bit of the origins of how we sort of came to write the book before sort of going into some of the key themes that link up very much with the themes of the wider conference. So Laurie and I met actually working at a UK-based think tank called IPPR. And around about 2018, when it was becoming increasingly clear the scale and severity of the climate crisis, what we were struck by was that actually the wider environmental crisis, so biodiversity collapse, the nitrogen cycle breaking down, crop fertility eroding, the whole set of interconnected and compounding breakdowns in the natural systems upon which all life thrive. These were either siloed, not really sort of located within sort of political analysis of the crisis, or often in some ways sort of downplayed or not connected. And so what we're trying to do with the book is really sort of stress, first of all, the scale of the compounding and interconnected crises of environmental collapse, not just climate crisis. And we'll have seen how bad that is. In some ways, the work of school strikers, Green New Dealers, social activists, and movements across the world have really sort of made the severity of the climate crisis really acute. And we saw obviously sort of code red for humanity the other day with the IPCC report. But just two sort of nuggets I sort of read in a report last week that it's sometimes easy to forget the scale of the sort of compounding crises. But from a Chatham House report, so the first is that on current trends, by 2040, which is really not that far away, roughly 700 million people a year are likely to be exposed to severe drought of at least 6 months duration. So that's one example of the scale. And even sooner, if we don't radically reduce emissions and change a whole set of industrial practices, by the 2030s, we're going to be looking at roughly 4 billion people experiencing major heat waves annually, which is roughly 12 times the current historic average. So the scale of crisis, I think, was one of the sort of key things we wanted to stress. And thankfully, the wider environment, political environment, is in some ways caught up with that, but it's still always worth re-stressing that, and particularly how the inequalities in that play out, both who actually drove this crisis in the first place, but who is actually bearing already and will bear the brunt of environmental breakdown. The second thing we really stress is that the crisis, above all, is a political crisis, which in some ways we think is, despite the sort of horror of the statistics and the lived experience of it all, we actually think that the sort of political nature of the crisis is actually overwhelmingly a positive and in some ways optimistic, hopeful resource to draw on. And it's a political crisis in the sense that, yes, it's a very difficult technical challenge. Yes, there are sort of hard choices and trade-offs here and there to be made in the transition to a post-carbon future, and one that is sort of environmentally balanced in the round. But it's not a question of do we have the resources, can we finance it, all these things we can do. The key challenge in a way that we really stress is the politics. The politics we need to unlock, the political coalitions we need to bring together, the sort of embedded fossil capital we need to dislodge, the politics of ambitions of hopeful transformation we need to cohere if we're going to sort of address the crisis. So that is in some ways, a really optimistic thing. And it's that sort of optimism of sort of, the Seamus Heaney quote that hope is not optimism, which expects things to turn out well, but something that is rooted in the conviction that there's good worth fighting for. And we really think that it's hopeful in the sense that we can collectively transform this with a vision of a better world. But transforming things requires addressing what is the sort of locomotive force driving environmental breakdown and driving the interconnected sort of polycrises that we're seeing, from COVID to the crisis of care to the crisis of inequality. And we argue in the book, and we sort of have a anecdote I can maybe go into in the Q&A, but about Easter Island, which sort of stands in for wider sort of historic processes of the evolution of global capitalism. And in particular, sort of three twin dynamics that in some ways map onto as a sort of the evil twin of the conference's themes of decommodify, democratize, and decarbonize. And those dynamics around expansion, enclosure, and extraction. And these sort of dynamics, whether it's applied to sort of natural resources, to labor, to sort of our data, wherever you look in the world, across history, the locomotive force of extractive capitalism has been about expansion, enclosure, and exploitation and extraction of labor and nature for the consolidation of wealth and power for the few at the expense of the many. And recognizing that sort of locomotive force is fundamental to then building politics that then can sort of begin to build a world beyond those dynamics. So then we turn to the agenda of the book, which in some ways the conference, which has been a fantastic success and wonderful to see. In some ways, sort of the slogan of democratize, decarbonize, decommodify rather pithily sums up what we were trying to do in far more words. But really, what we argue is that in some ways we need to sort of democratize some of the fundamental institutions that organize our economy. So whether that's the corporations of the foundational legal and political institution of capitalism, how do we make sure that labor and nature and society have voice in it, whether it's collective bargaining and trade union rights, whether it's the corporate governance of the firm. It's about democratizing who allocates capital, who drives investment. Should it be sort of the prerogative of a sort of small set of investors, or should public investment be driving the transition at the speed and scale we need, whether that's in clean energy systems, public transport networks, and on it goes. And then in terms of decommodification, we sort of set out a whole sort of sweep of things from green community wealth building, this idea of building up local economies when wealth and power is rooted in communities that actually create it in the first place. So that's whether that's free public transport that's sort of clean and green, through to decommodifying at wider scales, for example, our sort of systems of care. And obviously we've seen acutely during the COVID crisis. But really, we think that Planet on Fire argues, as do many others, we need to anchor sort of future decommodification in new ways of valorizing and rewarding and centering care work in all its dimensions, whether waged or unwaged. And in some ways, sort of the theme there is around this transition from a world of private consumption that's privatized both in production but also in consumption, to a world of communal luxury and democratic power. And that's a transition from enclosure to a commons of democratic sort of vitality and luxury is key to that. And then of course we sort of these things sound nice and they're easy to sort of whiz through in a quick sort of introductory overview, but in some ways one of the things we stress in the book is that the challenge for those of us in social movements, labor unions, politics, academics, etc., struggling to sort of try and bring to sort of birth this world of democratized and sort of decommodified leisure and pleasure, is we kind of know many of the ideas. The challenge is not really the ideas, it's, as I sort of said in some ways, the crisis is political. So it's about how do we build the coalitions that can actually take ideas and institutional transformations around ownership, control, and governance from well-meaning books for verso into the actual lived reality of billions of people around the world. And so we end sort of like drawing on the work of people like Stuart Hall and others around how can you construct sort of a majoritarian democratic coalition centered on meeting needs, centered on sort of pluralism, lifting up the voices of sort of marginalized communities that can stand against the sort of authoritarian populism that we see in many countries, and which kind of underpins in a sort of uneasy alliance with sort of extractive capitalism. And so we talk about how can we begin to prefigure change? So we look at sort of how can cities and towns sort of prefigure the change we want to see at national levels of test building the credibility of transformative politics. We talk about sort of politics that centers real material needs, and that's where things like decommodification can help, because you can really say to people like, look, this world will be like less environmentally stressed, there'll be less material throughput, but also your lives through the social wage, through sort of social security will be easier. And we talk about sort of a hopeful narrative, a narrative that can cohere many different material interests, many different cultural and social interests behind a positive vision of, yes, the planet's on fire, but critically we have the capacity, if we can collectively begin to sort of amass our democratic power, to actually build a world beyond fire and into sort of a much more regenerative future. So that's a very sort of quick overview. So I guess some of the 5 themes around the nature of the crisis, what's its driving force, some of the agenda, and some of the sort of political strategies to go beyond it. But really excited to hear what others on the panel think and what the audience will say a little later.
That's a really wonderful introduction, Mathew. Thank you very much. talking about capacities and capabilities, it seems to me that there are several different kinds of work that are emerging in your outline, from citizen work through to change and innovation work, and it might be interesting to explore in more depth what it would imply to democratize those kinds of work and give workers the capabilities that they need to actually undertake that kind of work. We're going to move on to Paddy. And Paddy is a research officer at Class Think Tank, and he's going to focus for us now on the role of the unions and organisations in democratising and decarbonising work.
Thanks, Ruth, and hi, everyone. Yeah, as we said, I work for Class, and we're a think tank sort of rooted in the trade union movement. And I think first I want to say that how positive a step it is that the environmental movement has started to adopt the language of a just transition and the idea that workers and trade unions should be heavily involved in that. And that's in the form of Matt's book, this event, but also you even see in places like Extinction Rebellion, the sort of argument over this fourth pledge, which encompasses a lot of these ideas. But I wanted to talk mostly about why the idea of a just transition is so vital, and not just on moralistic terms, because I think with the politicians that we have in the world at the minute, we can't rely on them upholding justice and fairness as sort of innate values. But there are, and we have to put forward an objective case, I think, why this transition must be just. Firstly, Matt's touched on this. I think there's a very real political imperative, whether we want to look at sort of 1930s Germany, Britain following the closure of the mines, similar processes in America. We know that when places are deindustrialized and left without a vision of hope, they become vulnerable to reactionary politics. And it's understandable to me that workers put their immediate material needs often before bigger ideas like the climate breakdown. And if we don't have a hopeful vision that creates security for everyone, then too often they're won over by people like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump. And these people will never implement the ambitious environmental policies that we need. Secondly, there's I think a strategic reason, like putting aside the idea of justice, we do need a transition one way or another. And I think climate activists of the past have been brilliant in sort of asserting the need to break with our current way of working, our current economy. But I just don't think it's serious to make these huge demands without also being able to propose a plan of how we can make this transition. And the reality is that while fossil fuel companies are not going to forward the most ambitious plan they can, they might be becoming slowly aware of its inevitability, but it's just simply not in their best interest to expedite this transition. And where if you look around the world for limited, but there are examples in parts of Canada, certain US states, and a lot of Nordic countries where meaningful transitional plans have been put in place, invariably trade unions have been involved there and have been sort of driving this change because they have an interest to make that transition work. And then finally, I'd say on a technical level, trade unions, if we're talking about democratizing work, trade unions already exist as an infrastructure to do so. And they have the sort of knowledge and stuff that is needed to create and implement this structural economic change. I think over recent years, the left has been very good at sort of promoting the idea of economic and political structures and explaining to people what that is. But we also have to understand those structures are built from individuals, from consumers, but also workers. There was a famous phrase often used in the student protests in Paris in the late 60s. They said, structures don't march on the street. And equally, structures don't mine coal, drill for oil, or manufacture private jets. And for me, trade unions are just a really good way of reconciling the sort of analytical tool of economic and political structures with the reality of individuals' behaviors, like more so than electoral politics, because citizens can exercise their electoral power once every 3 years for most people, but workers can exercise that power every day by choosing to go to work or not. And we can see this, like we've seen examples of Google workers refusing to work on military projects, or historically Scottish Rolls-Royce workers refusing to fix Chilean aircraft that were being used in the war. And I think one of our tasks is to embolden and empower workers to, particularly in trade unions, to not just make demands on their own material conditions, but on the world that they want to live in. Also, quickly, I'd say trade unions just have a lot of expertise of their industry, of what tasks are involved, what skills are involved. It is a complex process to plan this transition, and I think trade unions are just invaluable from a knowledge point of view. But also, they can bridge some of the gaps that I've mentioned between like the local level, the national level, and the international. Like those networks already exist and ripe to be expanded. But I would also say that this sort of environmental movement cannot just focus on trade unions that are obviously related to the climate, like fossil fuel industries or renewables, or even refitting homes. I think it's inevitable that in this transition, workers will shift to other sectors, and that the makeup of our economy will continue to change. And if we want that to be able to happen easily and for workers to make that transition happily, we need to strengthen trade unions and workers across the economy to make sure that sort of indirectly green sectors, particularly care work, but also things like the hospitality sector, culture industries, that these can match the security and conditions that people in the heavy industries are used to. And they're used to them precisely because of the strengths of trade unions historically in those sectors. So yeah, I think if we can make all work secure, all work well paid, and all occupations a sort of site of respect and pride, and ensure that people are given the support that they need, whether they're moving industry, retraining, or even just retiring early, then the threat of those certain industries coming to an end becomes a process that I think people don't need to fear, and that we can all share the rewards of. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paddy. That's really, really great. Just thinking about that a little bit, when you were talking about the alliances that need to be struck up between different kinds of organisations, public, private and civic, and trade unions and all the rest, I was just wondering whether in fact we do have all the organisations that we need to make a just transition, whether we can make do with the ones we've already got and repurpose those, or whether we need new ones altogether. But I'm going to move on now to Antonia, and Antonia is the Associate Director for the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and she's going to discuss the role of Commonwealth building and the state.
Thanks, Ruth, and hi everyone. First thing to say is I don't want to give anyone a headache, so I'm making a little cameo appearance, but I'm going to switch off my camera. Sorry about that. So as Ruth mentioned, I work for an organisation called CLES, which is the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. And we say that we're the national organisation for local economies. So we don't do work on the national advocacy stage, but instead work with local councils, local authorities, and also the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. And we work to promote inclusive local economic development, and mainly through a vehicle that Matt briefly mentioned earlier, and Ruth just mentioned, also called Community Wealth Building. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a moment, but I think when thinking about this panel and thinking about the themes of the book, of politics, of power, of strategy, with it, when it comes to advancing this agenda, I really think the future, or not the future, but a lot more effort needs to be expended onto the local level. And I really believe that the local level can ultimately assist very strongly with that national policy change that we want. And I guess I think this for three main reasons. We firstly know that a lot of progressives that are receptive to many of the ideas that we are discussing on this panel have power on a local level. And that's both true in the UK, but that's also true internationally. And so therefore, there's huge opportunities to change lives and improve communities today. And the UK, like many countries, almost all countries, I would argue, across the globe, is facing multiple overlapping crises today. And so engagement on the local level gives an opportunity to address and alleviate them in the present moment. Secondly, work on a local level allows for iterative policy experimentation. In the UK, we've had a Conservative government for over a decade. It doesn't look like that's going to change at any point soon. And so engagement with the local level and ultimately trial of policy on the local level gives us the opportunity to build up an evidence base for a potential national policy programme later down the line. And thirdly, and possibly most importantly, work on the local level builds a movement. We know that, of course, progressive leaders nationally get elected through having a strong support base, and proving impact locally works to build this. So what is community wealth building? In short, community wealth building is a model for local inclusive economic development. I'll talk about it in more detail in a moment in terms of the policies that sit within it. It's a very policy-rich agenda, but I think it's important to stress that it has three main objectives. First of all, it's trying to ensure that wealth, and by wealth I do not just mean the traditional economic sense of wealth, but also social wealth, environmental wealth. It's trying to make sure that wealth generated within a community stays within that community. Secondly, it's trying to make sure that the amount of wealth generated within a community is maximised. And thirdly, and most importantly possibly, it is trying to make sure that wealth is evenly distributed within a community. So moving on to the more policy-specific stuff that sits under community wealth building. In our iteration of it, it has 5 main pillars or arms or themes that all enable a just transition on a local level. So the first of those pillars is progressive procurement. This is perhaps the most famous of the community wealth building pillars. And progressive procurement is looking to support local businesses through public sector tendering and contracts. And perhaps more relevant for this panel, progressive procurement approaches seek to maximise social value. So it's looking at how can we inbuild environmental requirements into contracts and demand these requirements of public sector suppliers. Also under the progressive procurement arm, insourcing is explored. Perhaps that's something we'll chat about more in the Q&A. And particularly in the UK context, insourcing transport as perhaps contracts expire with private providers is something that can really accelerate this agenda. Second pillar is around land and property. So again, it's looking at public sector land and assets and how they are supporting the just transition. So what plans there are to retrofit insulation into buildings. For example, how carbon friendly are the the fleet of various public institutions, but also it's looking at when assets need to be disposed, and they do need to be disposed of. Are options being explored around, for example, community energy generation, as opposed to perhaps previous models of economic development that have sold off lands and assets to the highest bidder? The fourth pillar is around financial power, which is fairly self-explanatory. So it's looking at which levers are in place, both locally and nationally, and how can they be flexed to advance community wealth building. So, for example, that could be looking at what are public sector pension pots doing, how can we divest them from high carbon industries and into renewable energy. But then it's also looking at things such as, in the UK context, the Levelling Up agenda, the Levelling Up fund, and looking at how they can be delivered in a just way. Final pillar is around plural ownership. So in short, that is looking at what can be done to stimulate different types of public and private ownership in communities. We know that resilient economies, and by resilient I both mean resilient in perhaps the traditional economic sense, but also environmentally resilient. We know that resilient economies are diverse economies, with many forms of generative businesses found within them. So that's of course small and medium-sized enterprises, but that's also cooperatives, social enterprises, community interest companies. So this pillar is looking at how the generative business sector is being supported within communities. So community wealth building is a model that's being very successfully implemented across the UK and around the world. And in my mind, as I said at the beginning, it's an incredibly crucial ingredient to winning the case for national action later down the line. And ultimately, of course, we know that the path to net zero varies from country to country, but also within countries, the path to net zero is very regionally different. So, the needs of inner London to achieve net zero are obviously very different to rural Scotland. And so therefore, community wealth building suggests, and I suggest that, one size fits all model it is not suitable, and community wealth building provides the mechanism to ensure bespoke delivery with a focus on democratic engagement throughout. I'm pretty sure I've run over time, so the final thing that I'll say, which is perhaps not as strategic or policy focused, but I think community wealth building is also serving to provide a lot of hope for progressives that things can be different. Progressives had a very difficult time of it of late. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. And I really believe that community wealth building provides something to mobilise around, to get excited about, and crucially, of course, to address the environmental emergency today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonia. That's really great, absolutely fascinating. To me, it still begs the question of what is the nature of the work that must be undertaken in order to achieve community wealth building projects, and how does that work need to be designed? And I was also quite interested in what would be the interrelations between different wealth building entities. How are wealth builders to connect to one another across different kinds of cities, regions, countries, or whatever? So it's not just about sort of local development, but it's about international development and the learnings from one another. Maybe we could explore some of that further in relation to democratizing work. But I'd like to move on now to Path, and welcome Path. Path is a research fellow at the IPPR think tank and also at UCL. He looks at the political economy of health and democratic reform, and he also worked in A&E during the first wave of the pandemic. He's going to talk to us about political coalitions and strategies in Commonwealth building.
Thanks, Ruth. And hi everyone, good evening, or good evening from London. It might be a different sort of part of the day, wherever you're tuning into this. So let's start with this idea. It's a sort of very widely held belief across societies that some people deserve to be paid more for the job they do than others because they work harder or they're more skilled. This is a very widely held meritocratic belief among rich and poor. In fact, poor people are slightly more likely to believe in this statement, according to the LSE's Institute of Inequalities and Sutton's Trust. It's a really interesting and powerful concept. Except if some people deserve to be paid more because of their job they do, some people then also deserve to live more because of the job they do? Because that's exactly what's happened. We take the most recent proximal example is obviously the pandemic. People in the hospitality sector are seven times more likely to have died in the past 18 months than a businessman or a businesswoman. And the point I'm trying to make here is that these are two sides of the same coin, sort of the way your job determines your pay and the way that your job determines how long you get to live there. These are interconnected. In fact, I would argue they're actually almost exactly the same thing. And it sort of pushes back against this mantra of meritocracy that I think is relatively ingrained. I was brought up on it myself. And it's sort of this concept that I think Matt's book brings out very well, and we've heard a few people talk about already before me in terms of interconnected issues, this ability to think in systems and therefore solve in systems. The climate issue is also a health issue. It will lead to more pandemics. It will do a lot more than that. It's a human issue. The most migration is going to be completely transformed by climate politics. In fact, it's probably going to be the biggest push on people to move where they live than that history's ever seen. And if climate politics was already not heated enough, wait till migration starts to interact with that. It's already starting, but that's someone to watch out for. And of course, it's a work issue. And being able to connect the dots between these things, climate, health, wealth, work, is really important because it sort of frames how we then go about trying to do something about it. And that's where there's a really big gap at the moment. So what do we do? I'll try and give a few examples and hopefully you'll see a theme emerge. So let's start with one aspect of the climate and nature emergency, global warming, probably the most notable aspect. So what do we do about global warming? And the notion that was really popularized in, I don't know, over the 70s or 80s was the idea of the carbon footprint. What can you do to help global warming? Ironically, it was something that was framed and developed by BP, but it was very much about what you as the individual could do in terms of altering your behavior. I'm not just talking about the don't rinse your dishes before you put in the dishwasher type of Tory strategy. I'm talking about sort of, well, why don't you think about what you eat? Why don't you think about whether you should fly or not? And there's nothing, people listening to this may have decided not to fly, but it sort of ignores the fact that half of flight-related carbon emissions are private jets. So beyond the climate, let's think about like race relations. Let's think about racial politics. Last June was the last May probably. I think it was the time where protests erupted across the world. Black Lives Matter was heard everywhere. Buses, boardrooms. You couldn't go anywhere without hearing it. Except everyone was saying Black Lives Matter. No one was really talking about the solutions the movement was putting forward. What the anti-racism reckoning has become, at least in Britain, is it's really distilled into two things. Let's educate individuals, particularly educating white people, and let's put more minority ethnic people into boardrooms. And this is across all sectors, all workplaces. There's this movement, EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, which is now apparently the solution to structural racism. If Ambeva Sivanandan was still alive, he probably would have said, such initiatives deal not with the politics of discrimination, but it's arithmetic, rearranging the distribution of inequality as not to alter the structures of the inequalities themselves. You see this in health as well, which is sort of the field I come from, health inequalities. Why do some people get to live 10 years longer than others in Britain? Just yesterday, Boris Johnson sort of suggested it's something to do with the royal jelly people were eating in one part of the country, but they don't have access to that royal jelly in Blackpool. So it's again, and that's one of the most pervasive types of individualized meritocratic beliefs. Your health is actually about your decisions as well, what you're doing. It's about what you're eating and the way you're exercising. And I think the theme I was trying to hopefully was emerging there was this sort of, we could call it sort of a neoliberal justice approach, which is structural problem, but individual solution. And that never adds up. It doesn't work, but that's the trend you see for all these sort of systemic or structural, bigger than the individual problems, but individuals can only have to solve it themselves. They can't organize it to something bigger. What Paddy was alluding to, sort of become a structure in themselves. It's something you need to do. And that's inherently problematic. So that kind of leads me into the politics of it. So if the people in power won't prescribe the bigger than the individual solutions we need for these crises, climate crises, health crises, work crises, then we have to ask, where does power lie, and should it lie elsewhere? And I really like Matt's sort of coining. It's a really simple phrase, but it's really powerful. The crisis is political. The planet on fire means we have to forge a different type of politics. And the really difficult question is how. And I think every speaker so far has expressed some pessimism in how we should be able to do that, at least in Western liberal democracies, and what we should be doing to go about that. And again, Matt's book sort of refers a lot to Stuart Hall, and sort of his particular essay, I think it was Brave New World, or Lessons from Thatcher. It sort of talks about politics has to be hegemonic. You have to think not just in terms of policy terms, not just in an economic strategy, but a social strategy, a cultural strategy, a whole vision that all encompassing is all these things. And that's how you achieve this sort of systemic transformation that we're going about. And Hall also talks about sort of the conjuncture. And this is a phrase that you hear it every year. There's always a conjuncture, but we might actually be at one. Not just talking about the pandemic and the climate and nature emergency, but there's an ideological shift, especially in sort of macroeconomics. That's probably the first one that's happened since the 90s, and people are thinking a bit differently, and much of that has been powered through the way we're thinking about the climate and the way the economy relates to it. So there's an opportunity here for us to think about. And I guess what that means we should question is sort of, it could talk about all sorts of different policy issues, but I guess the key one is our democratic institutions, for me at least. And I think it'll be interesting to talk about that a bit further on in our Q&A. And I think a really simple definition from the Britannica Encyclopedia is that democracy is a form of government where power is vested in people, and then people then exercise that power, usually through elected representatives. Except how much power do people have, and who are the elected representatives representing? It's broadly accepted in sort of political economy literature that people and the electorate only exert a small influence on policy and decision making. Initially, people didn't think they were important at all. Sort of varieties of capitalism, Hall and Soskius, the people didn't feature at all. Political economy shifted on a bit. People exert the views of people, not everyone in society, but the views in general of the middle class do exert an influence on policy, but it's only a marginal influence relative to producer groups and corporations. So I guess, how do you modulate that relationship in terms of who has voice? And you can think of all sorts of things. The one that always comes to people's mind, which I think is an important part of the puzzle, it's not the whole answer, is electoral reform. The first past the post system in Britain suppresses certain people's voices. A British Bangladeshi or British Pakistani vote is not worth the same as a British English vote because of first past the post. Reforming that to something that's a bit more proportional will mean more voice bubbles up from the bottom into our politics. But what's far more important, I think, was some of the stuff that Antonia was talking about in terms of local government and devolving and connecting, I guess, people's voice up to power. So it's no good doing a citizens' assembly if it doesn't really influence anything. How does that then wire into decision making? And how do you give a bigger voice to community organisers and grassroots organisations? And that's where I'll leave it, because I could keep talking on that issue for sure. But that's the sort of the way I see this, and the way I think, at least I think about these problems. I'd be interested to hear what everyone else does.
Thank you very much, Parth. That was really great, and certainly I think it highlighted what other people have been touching on in this panel, which is the need to think about political action and political work. I'm going to invite people to add comments and questions to the Q&A. But whilst you're thinking about that and doing that, I wonder if I could ask the panel a question. Thinking about all this together, I still wonder what is the core work that must be done in order to achieve this Commonwealth Building Manifesto, particularly in the context of climate change. And if we can identify what that core work looks like, how is it to be organised and to deliver the kinds of experiences of work, decent work, meaningful work, whatever it may be, that we might find desirable and would fall under the umbrella of work being democratised. So, Antonia, you've turned your video on, so I'd really like to ask you to go ahead and answer the question.
Sure, thanks, Ruth. And on that note, I'm going to turn it off again. So thinking about this question of what is the nature of the work, and what are the networks sort of needed to enable it to happen. I think when it comes to community wealth building, there's perhaps three more tangible actions. I think the first thing is a recognition that addressing the climate emergency, realising the just transition, it is not solely the preserve of climate and environmental teams within public institutions. All speakers have touched on the fact that democratic engagement interlinks with health, interlinks with transport. So I think the first thing is to move out of this model of economic development that focuses on sectors of our economy in silos and actually puts the just transition as an umbrella over all of them, and puts environmental breakdown as the issue which these departments seek to address. I think secondly, we need to recognise the power of delivery. So I think many people don't realise that although budgets and high-level targets are decided on the national stage, actually the local is the place where it is decided how that money gets spent. And obviously there is a huge power in delivery in that sense. I spoke about progressive procurement. It is completely transformative for a community if the £50 million contract coming down the line from the council is going to local generative low carbon firms supporting good quality low carbon jobs over it is all going to one multinational extractive conglomerate often housed in a tax haven. So recognizing the power of delivery, and then I think maybe finally there's a big job to be done within the UK context, but further afield as well, around recognizing the fact that public institutions and public services are market shapers as well as they are deliverers of services. So the NHS is a huge employer within the UK context. It's also a huge polluter, and in turn it shapes the demand on itself by its employment practices, by its decarbonisation strategy, etc. So I think, so firstly, perhaps dissolving of silos. Secondly, a point around recognising the power of delivery. And then thirdly, recognising that public services, through how they procure, through how they employ, actually shape the need for those services.
Thank you very much, Antonia. Paddy, would you like to comment on this question of what is the core work that we need to identify and get on with, and how we should organise it?
Yeah. Something Antonia said in the first time she spoke about the sort of what it means to be resilient really reminded me of a book that I read that has informed a lot of my thinking recently, called The Mushroom at the End of the World by Singh. And it sort of uses this analogy of resilience. It talks about resilience a lot and people have mentioned it here. I think the analogy of an ecosystem, a robust ecosystem as opposed to like monocropping in nature, that maps to economics really well. I think like we need an ecosystem of different like sorts of companies, which I think it really plays out in the idea of the community wealth building. But I think it equally maps to politics. I think we need an ecosystem of politics, and I don't think for me it's like sort of poetic that you would take this cue from nature, but I don't think there is one set of core work that will do this. I think I'm really, really supportive of the community wealth building. I think that is, really important to bring power and wealth back to a local level. I mean, obviously, I am involved in trade unions, and I do think that is a really important strand of work to boost the power of workers. And for me, trade unions are an existing way to do that. And I think I did a report that I wrote about what happened to workers over the pandemic, gave me some hope in that it's quite clear that from union membership numbers, but also surveys about engagement, that being the sort of very basic demands of just being paid and being safe at work have sort of reminded people that they can organize, and they've found people finding new ways of organizing that might not be traditional trade union tactics, but people are seeing that they can affect change in their workplace. I think it's undoubtedly that levels of organization at work and direct action at work are increasing and have been for a number of years now. And I think a lot of the work that this sort of set of people that might be here needs to do is to sort of recognize that ecosystem and to shift some of their efforts away from, let's say, the electoral route, and to put efforts into this community wealth building, into organizing at work. And I think the hard thing about that is it has to be kind of organic. People need to make a decision of like, what am I best placed to do? Where does my passion lie? Where can I put most emphasis? But to recognize that electoral politics is not the only way that we're going to do this, and that there's lots of other things going on that all need to sort of work together.
Thank you, Paddy. This idea of a work ecosystem, it seems to me to have quite important connections to some of the things that Path was talking about, and particularly the experiences of workers during the pandemic who put themselves in harm's way for our sake. And in the context of Commonwealth building, I suppose it would really explode and challenge the current ways in which we do things. I mean, to talk about job descriptions, for example, how does that make sense? How on earth does it make sense to talk about discretionary effort? It goes, what workers have experienced during the pandemic goes well beyond anything that could ever be put into a standard job description, and it undermines that whole way of kind of managing work. Path, it would be really interesting to just get you very briefly your comment on that before I turn to Mathew at the end to kind of give us some concluding thoughts on where all of this needs to go. Path, it would just be really interesting to get your thoughts on a work ecosystem, the limits and that we've arrived at in terms of the organisation of work, and what this would imply for politics in the way in which you discussed it.
So I'll try and keep it brief. So I think there's potentially a moment here where more and more people start to consider work not just as a means to an end, but as a means in itself. I think particularly some of those professions that have been public facing during the pandemic, essential workers, and in those sectors in particular. And I guess I'm referring to sort of this probably transient temporary phenomenon of labour shortages in slightly peculiar places. And rather than speculate on why that could be happening, it does have this potential great reevaluation thing about it. People have moved on for different reasons. People are starting to ask, well, what do they want from work? And not everyone has the ability to ask that, but some people are. And one can hope that that then sort of starts to filter upwards in terms of how we organize work and how we organize workers, in terms of, I guess, in terms of what Paddy was describing and how unions sort of exert their influence outside of politics. I think that's absolutely right. And potentially there's a moment here to think about work in a more holistic way, and come through. I think ultimately I do think party politics is probably still one of the major mediums through which transformative change happens. And I think that then sort of starts to create the thing, okay, well, we've got lots of political parties across the West now, sort of reclaiming the worker and announcing things that we've heard again and again and again, but can it actually mean anything? And how can that mobilize people? Will that sort of messaging work? And what are the right kinds of policies to shift us into a way where we're looking at work in a very different way to how we have in the past, and whether when we go beyond just labour market regulation into actually, well, there's only a limit to the amount of rules can do, and ownership is key to this, and ownership is democracy, and can we create that politics? I don't know, but there is potentially a moment here for that type of conversation to be had.
Thank you very much. So there's something here again about the work of politics, something here about democratic innovation and the work that's associated with that. Mathew, as you're listening to all of this and thinking about the manifesto that you've laid out, what would you say about the nature of work as a kind of central element of bringing that manifesto into being?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's fundamental in a way. And I think it's in some ways worth stepping back and saying, well, what do we want work to look like? You know, if it's currently organized along, relationships of domination, hierarchy, extraction, exploitation, and all the other things we know. We want a world of work in which, individuals, but then collectives have autonomy, dignity, the ability to sort of explore their own capabilities, and work to be a thing in which they do because it sort of supports their and communal flourishing rather than because they need to work simply to live, which is obviously the case for now. And if that's the type of future we want, then I suppose, we can then think about the institutions that would wrap around a reimagined future of work. So that both within the workplace, fundamentally, it's about re-empowering labour, both individually through a sort of much stronger baseline of rights, but then also really importantly, collectively, whether sort of workplace, sort of trade union rights or sort of collective bargaining across sectors. So it's about sort of the legal infrastructures that sort of shape, work and power within work. It's about the legal structures that shape, democratizing the firm. Obviously, lots of people in this conference have worked on about ownership and governance. But then it's not just about that. It's about rebalancing power more widely to improve work, so that people work when they want to, and when there's good work available, not because they have to. So that's about, a social security system that is not punitive, but actually supports individuals to thrive outside of the marketplace. So that's, high social security benefits, not being, sort of overly punitive or sort of means tested, etc. It's about really radically expanding the social wage, which brings in decommodification. So that's about how can we extend, free at the point of use, adult social care, childcare, transport systems, food systems, all these type of things that basically reduce the pressure to take work because you have to, but you take work when you want to. And then you also then need a sort of public investment strategy, which can build a sort of high pressure, low inequality economy. So you need to sort of maintain a high pressure economy with lower inequality, but better work, but less work. And so, you need to aim for full employment. You need to sort of challenge, and obviously there's political challenge there that going back to people like Kaleki have stressed that actually, private investment doesn't maintain full employment because they actually use the fear of the sack, the fear of unemployment as actually a sort of disciplining tool for labour. So we need to think about, how do we maintain full employment as a wider macro goal to support the creation of good work. And if you put that all together, better, stronger rights individually and collectively at work, transformed legal sort of infrastructure that reshapes and democratizes the firm, social security system that gives people dignity to live outside of the marketplace well, and sort of macro environment that basically like puts the public interest, not private capital's prerogatives, first. That's the sort of set of ecosystems, this hybrid ecosystems that Paddy was mentioning, that can deliver a much better future of work. But clearly, and this goes to what Parth and Antonio have been saying, clearly what that does is challenge very directly the prerogatives of the sort of the few that are benefiting from our current institutional arrangements. And so then it goes back to, well, how can we organize power, whether it's in the workplace, in social movements, in formal political parties, international solidarity. So that's the work that really needs to be done if we're going to transform work itself. You're on mute.
Apologies. I'm going to let Antonia, Paddy and Parth have one final thought each. Very quick, one sentence. Antonia first.
Great, thank you. And yeah, thanks to the other speakers. It's been a really interesting panel. Yeah, one final thought, I guess perhaps that we haven't touched on so much on the panel today. It is around the impact of COVID-19 and how that's changed, whether you call it the Overton window or the baseline of what's acceptable with regards to this agenda. And I think my final thought is, and we haven't, it's a massive topic, but COVID-19 has presented an amazing window of opportunity to change things. Over the last 18 months, we've seen unprecedented levels of government intervention, and we know that there will be a huge stimulus package coming down the line. And so really everything is to play for at the moment. And I think although we live under a Conservative government, more than at any point in the last 10 years, there is an opportunity now to fundamentally shift policy with regards to just transition.
Thank you very much. Paddy, as brief as you can make it. Parth, you go next. I think we've lost Paddy.
Sure. Yeah. I think my final comment is that looking forwards, I think the politics of the future of work is probably going to be one of the most transformative things on how we live, and it deserves a lot more attention in a wider audience. I think in the sort of the struggle for the emancipation of labour from capital, I think there's a risk that we sort of also accidentally forget or don't look at capital trying to emancipate itself from labour. So people could be moving in the same direction for very different reasons. And I think that's something that democratizing the firm and democratic ownership gets around. And I think that's why it's so key we try and popularize this concept of democratizing work rather than just talking about rights and pay and welfare.
Thank you all very much. It's been a really great discussion. I've enjoyed it so much. And I hope to hear a lot more about this work that you do together and what it will yield. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Cheers.